Welcome to this podcast from the Medical Journal of Australia. My name is Sam Hunt, the MJA's News and Online Editor. Today we are discussing research into breast cancer, which has found the risk of death from breast cancer is 43% higher for women who do not receive ongoing treatment in a timely way. The research, published in the Medical Journal of Australia, examined associations between breast cancer survival and timeliness of treatment, in line with the 2020 Australian Guidelines for the Treatment of Early Breast Cancer. You can read this research in the description of this podcast. And the researchers are with me now. Professor Peter Baade is a biostatistician and the Senior Manager of Descriptive Epidemiology at Cancer Council Queensland. And Dr Kou Kou is the Senior Research Officer of Epidemiology, also at Cancer Council Queensland. Professor Baade and Dr Kou Kou, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
Now, you've recently done research into both rare cancers and breast cancer. The breast cancer research is published in the MJA. Let me ask you about that first. Dr Kou Kou, you looked at intervals of treatment in Australian patients. Can you tell me what you found?
Sure. When Cancer Australia updated the treatment guidelines for early breast cancer in 2020 for the first time, they included recommendations for the optimal time periods for 6 treatment intervals. When we talk about treatment interval, it simply means the time between different phases of treatment. So treatment intervals include, for example, the time from diagnosis to surgery, the time from surgery to chemotherapy, and so on. Our study examined whether the survival for women diagnosed with early breast cancer varied depending on whether the treatment interval met the recommended times. We found that many women experienced at least one treatment interval that was longer than what the guidelines recommended, and that those women had significantly lower survival. This was especially so for those women who experienced a longer time than recommended between diagnosis to surgery, or between surgery to chemotherapy, or between completing adjuvant chemotherapy and the start of radiotherapy. In addition, we were able to quantify the optimal treatment intervals in terms of improving breast cancer survival, with most of this consistent with the existing guidelines.
And Professor Baade, I'll turn to you now. What prompted this research?
In the updated treatment guidelines, most of the recommendations about the optimal treatment intervals for early breast cancer were based on expert advice. And this was because a high-level scientific evidence was just not available. So they had to use the best evidence available. We were able to use the results from a cohort of more than 3,300 women who had been diagnosed with breast cancer in Queensland between 2010 and 2013. So while they were diagnosed before the introduction of these guidelines, we were still able to match their treatment patterns to the current guidelines and to then quantify what their survival outcomes were and compare those with the current treatment guidelines. So overall, our results have provided higher level scientific support for the current Australian treatment guidelines than was previously the case.
And Kou Kou, what are the risk factors associated with longer treatment intervals?
Sure. When it comes to the factors affecting treatment intervals, we can break them down into 2 main groups: those linked to the healthcare system and those linked to the women themselves. For instance, that where you have your screening done can impact the length of treatment interval. So women using public screening facilities tend to have longer treatment intervals compared to those using private ones. And the timing matters too. Starting or completing treatment in December to January often leads to longer intervals between treatments. On the other hand, some factors are individual ones. Women without a family history of ovarian or breast cancer often have longer treatment intervals compared to those with a family history. Smoking, lower household income, and not having private health insurance were also linked to longer treatment. And where you live matters too. Women in regional or remote areas tended to experience longer treatment intervals than those living in major cities.
And Professor Baade, what would you say are the implications of this research for the medical community in terms of the need for timely treatments?
Absolutely. So, cancer treatment guidelines are designed to promote consistent, high quality healthcare. This research has provided new scientific evidence that supports the current guidelines for the treatment of early breast cancer. And the findings emphasize the importance of timely treatment and also that delays in getting that treatment cost lives. So this is important stuff. And finally, by identifying subgroups of women diagnosed with early breast cancer who are more likely to have these longer treatment intervals, we hope that these results can inform the development of future interventions that are targeted to these groups and help these vulnerable groups to get more timely treatment.
Let's turn now to your work on rare cancers. Your research here found that Australians living in regional and more disadvantaged areas are more likely to have adverse outcomes after a rare cancer diagnosis. Let me start by asking, how common are rare cancers in Australia, Professor Baade?
So, internationally, a cancer is defined as being rare if it's diagnosed in fewer than 6 people for every 100,000 Australians per year. So in other words, when there's less than 1,500 cases in the whole Australian population that are diagnosed with that particular cancer type each year. And there's also some rare cancer types that have extremely small numbers of cases, so less than 5. But there's a twist, because there's about 200 individual rare cancer types. So when we put those all together, they account for more than 20% of all cancers diagnosed in the country. So this is getting up to nearly 30,000 rare cancers diagnosed. And that's part of the conundrum because they're categorized as rare cancers, but there's actually a large number of people diagnosed with a rare cancer type.
And Kou Kou, I'll go to you for this. Why is it hard to conduct Australian research into rare cancers?
It is hard to collect enough data about individual rare cancer types for meaningful research, and it's hard to find enough patients for clinical trials. That slows the progress in developing new treatment and evidence-based management strategies. For the same reason, the small number of patients, there is also less known about the symptoms of rare cancers, which can lead to late or incorrect diagnosis. By using an international standard definition for rare cancers, we can examine the group as a whole rather than by individual types.
And Professor Baade, tell me what you found from your research and what's the impact of geography on people's survival outcomes?
We found that rare cancer types collectively comprised about 1/5 of all cancer diagnoses across Australia. And they also account for 1/4 of cancer-related deaths. So it has a big impact. Now also the overall 5-year survival rate for patients diagnosed with a rare cancer type is about 53%. So that's quite a bit lower than the survival rate for all cancers combined, which is just over 70%. So rare cancers make a big contribution to the overall impact that cancer has, or the cancer burden in this country. One of the ways that we characterise geographical location in Australia is by the socio-economic characteristics. And this is calculated by the ABS, and it utilises things like the income and education level and a range of other factors of the population. So what we found was that people living in socio-economically disadvantaged areas were more likely, on average, to have a higher incidence of rare cancer types. Now, additionally, once people in those areas are diagnosed with a rare cancer type, they also had worse than average survival. So it's a double whammy. And the combination of those two things, higher incidence and poorer survival, magnifies the negative impact that rare cancer types have on people who live in these socio-economically disadvantaged areas. We also found strong evidence that survival for people who live in rural and remote areas of the country also have substantially worse than average survival. So there's big differences by geographical area. And we found clear evidence that based on the geographical patterns of incidence and survival across Australia, that the impact of rare cancer types is greatest for those people living in socio-economically disadvantaged areas and also in remote areas of the country.
It prompts me to ask why. Now, I understand your study was not designed to answer the why, but asking you to speculate here, why do you think this is the case, and where do risk factors come in?
As you mentioned, this work that we did, it's not designed to answer the questions about why. However, one of the key motivations to do this type of research is to motivate people, other researchers, policy people, to ask that question and to carry out further research to uncover the reasons why. One of the aspects about the survival differences is that we do know that people with rare cancer types require specialist diagnostic and treatment facilities, even more so than the more common cancer types. And these facilities tend to be concentrated in the major cities of Australia. So this means that people who live outside major cities often need to travel long distances for diagnosis and treatment. One additional point that I would just like to emphasise is that these studies are the result of a collaboration of many people. So I'd just like to acknowledge the other authors on these papers and also the work that we carry out. We depend on the cancer registries across the country to collect the details about cancer. I'd just like to acknowledge the work that the cancer registries do and the high quality of the data that they continually make available for research purposes.
Professor Baade and Dr Kou Kou, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you again for the opportunity. It was great.
Great to be here.
My special guests have been Professor Peter Baade, a biostatistician and the Senior Manager of Descriptive Epidemiology at Cancer Council Queensland, and Dr Kou Kou, who is the Senior Research Officer of Epidemiology, also at Cancer Council Queensland. You can read their research by clicking on the link in the description of this podcast. You can find more podcasts on our website at mja.com.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.